It's intensifying and becoming more brutal. The war between Russia and Georgia spills out of South Ossetia. Tens of thousands have been forced from their homes. Despite another Georgian offer of a ceasefire and intensive diplomatic efforts, there's no sign either side is really ready to stop the fighting. I'm Shihab Ratansi. You're watching Al Jazeera live from Washington. Also on the program, tension in Tbilisi as the fighting spreads. People in Georgia's capital fear Russian troops could surround the city. Targeting Musharraf, Pakistan's coalition leaders are finalizing plans to impeach their president. And tensions on the rise in Indian-administered Kashmir as police kill a popular politician at a protest rally. As the war between Georgia and Russia enters its fifth day, there seems to be no end in sight, with bombings and firefights still raging and Georgian forces in retreat. Russian troops have pushed their way into Georgia itself. Georgia says Russian forces have taken up positions outside the city of Gori, which saw another mass evacuation to Tbilisi, the capital, now gripped with anxiety that it will be invaded. Amid the sharp war of words between Russia and Georgia, the international community is still struggling to end the violence. Civilians remain caught in the crossfire. Thousands of refugees continue to pour out of South Ossetia into Georgia and Russian-controlled North Ossetia. A look at some of the latest developments now. Georgia is reported to have resumed aerial and artillery bombardment of Skinvali, the main town in South Ossetia. To the west, Russia confirms its forces are advancing from the other breakaway region of Abkhazia, though Russia denies Georgian claims it's entered the Black Sea port of Poti. The Russian Defense Ministry says its operation in the town of Sernaki, which lies outside the so-called security zone of Abkhazia, was needed to avert further attacks by Georgia on South Ossetia. US President Bush is demanding Russia reverse course, and French President Nicolas Sarkozy continues his peace mission in the region. Civilian casualty figures impossible at this stage to independently confirm, but it's believed over 1,000 civilians may have been killed so far. Battles continue near the South Ossetian capital. These are dramatic new pictures. A Russian military convoy escorting refugees traveling toward the Russian province of North Ossetia when a firefight erupted between South Ossetian fighters and what are believed to be Georgian troops. That road, the only one linking South Ossetia in Georgia to North Ossetia in Russia. As Russian forces pushed deeper into Georgia, a full-scale evacuation of Gori began amid fears of a possible Russian advance into that city. Our correspondent Jonah Hull was among the exodus. He sent us this report of his trip to Tbilisi.
With little warning, the evacuation of Gori began. There was nothing orderly about this retreat. Tanks, artillery, troops and civilians. This was panic. They'd heard the Russians were within 5 kilometers of Gori. That turned out to be true. A stricken tank explodes. A Russian potshot. Escaping vehicles barely flinch. Back on the road, Tbilisi bound. At this moment, Russian army units are fighting through the remaining flimsy defences outside Gori.
Well, we're inside the city limits of Tbilisi now. Cars, civilian cars and military vehicles still streaming into the city. And this as news comes in that the Russians are in Gori.
The only question now, where will the Russians go next? Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi.
And thousands of refugees have fled that fighting. Former residents of the South Ossetian capital are now being housed in North Ossetia. There are estimates that as many as 30,000 have crossed into Russia's southern regions for shelter. Many of them women, children and the elderly, housed in tents with folding beds and fed at a makeshift canteen and open-air kitchen. The Georgian government has released a statement saying it's, quote, urgently seeking international intervention to prevent the fall of Georgia. Troops are patrolling the streets of the capital Tbilisi, where the mood is somber and tense. Residents are stocking up on basic supplies to prepare for the prospect of a Russian invasion. Alan Fisher reports from a city gripped by fear.
At the edge of Tbilisi, soldiers manned checkpoints, scanning traffic coming into the capital. We've been told to keep our lights off, but if we take the camera and move it in as close as we can, you'll see the outline of perhaps hundreds of soldiers. They're based right around Tbilisi, and they're all waiting for the Russian advance. Army patrols are on the move, many heading north, the road they fear the Russians will use if they decide to take Tbilisi. Despite the late hour, this was the scene at petrol stations across the city. People panic buying, worried supplies may soon be hard to come by. Shops stayed open late as people queued to stock up on water and other essential items. At the presidential palace, ministers gathered to discuss latest developments while people waited outside for news. On the streets, neighbours formed little groups, discussing the possibility of invasion and what they'd do if the Russians come. But at strategic locations in Tbilisi, such as the Parliament building and the TV station, there was no sign of increased security, perhaps suggesting the government wasn't as worried as its people. The roads here are almost empty. Many people are at home, but few will sleep soundly in their beds. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, Tbilisi.
Meanwhile, it's been another day of intense diplomatic efforts and some bombastic words. A meeting of the UN Security Council broke up in the last hour. We've been monitoring developments from New York with our John Terrett, who joins us now. John, tell us more, first of all, actually, about that French Security Council resolution that's being drafted.
Yes, that's the latest news. The meeting broke up after a day's worth of bilateral meetings involving various countries in buildings away from UN headquarters. They met for about 2 hours in and around the Security Council chamber, and then it finished. And the headline news was that the French are going to put forward a new draft resolution. And the situation at the moment is that the French are busy distributing that document among the 15 members of the Security Council, who will go away, read it overnight and come back in the morning and decide whether or not to vote. Now, after the meeting was over, we heard from 3 prominent actors in the Russian-Georgia war, beginning with the Georgian ambassador to the United Nations, Irakli Alassania is his name. He came and appealed to the Security Council to take seriously the French document and to act quickly.
As I mentioned to the Security Council, today Russia changed the history back towards the Cold War, when the military power is trying to subdue and crush young democracy by overwhelming power. The full military invasion of Georgia is going on.